Hello friends, it's Shari here today, and I am going to be showing you how I made this fun Swish and Pop card that has the theme of Kermit singing the Rainbow Connection. So I sung this song a lot in my head while I was making this card, and maybe you're going to do that too as you watch the video today. I'm starting out with a 5.5 inch by 5.5 inch square piece of Bristol cardstock, and that's what I'm going to do my background ink blending on. So I'm making a very large square card today. I'm starting out with Squeezed Lemonade, and this is the bottom of my sky. So you can see how I don't have it all the way to the bottom of the card because that's going to get covered up by my grasses and my pond. I'm going in with Twisted Citron for that middle green color, and then finally I've got peacock feathers for the top. And I did make this super speedy blending just to keep my video time down a little bit today because this is quite a large involved card, but I'm just going back and forth between my colors until I get that nice blend that I want. I'm also going to do some stenciling on top of this. So I use regular distress inks for my background, but for my stenciling I'm going to use distress oxides. I'm going to use my media mat, and I've just put some removable adhesive to hold my piece of paper in place on that mat. And then I'm going to use magnets to hold my stencils. So I'm using the Bayou backdrop stencil, and I'm starting out with the vines. I'm going to put my magnets here at the bottom, but since that stencil is really close to the edge at the top, I decided just to use a piece of tape to hold it at the top. I'm going to use oxides for my vines and my leaves. So I'm going in with the Rustic Wilderness oxide. This is a nice dark green color for the vines. I always feel like the vines should be a little darker than the leaves. And since this is a pigment ink, it's going to sit on top of that ink blended background that I created, and you're going to see it very well. Next, I can take the leaves from the same stencil set and line those up with the vines. There's an etching on the stencil that shows you where to line it up. Again, putting magnets at the bottom and a little piece of tape at the top. And for the leaves, I'm going to use Lucky Clover Distress Oxide. So this is going to cover up that vine a little bit, and you're going to get those bright green leaves on that softer background that we created. Now before I add the next step, which is some clear gel, I'm just going to wipe off some of this excess ink that's sitting on top of that stencil. So I'm just using a dry paper towel to kind of wipe it away. Next, I'm going to use some transparent gel to put through the same stencil. So I didn't move this at all. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm just going to put a light layer through the stencil, and then I'm going to put glitter on top of it. So I'm basically making my own glitter paste. So I've got that gel on top of those leaves, and then I'm just going to dump a bunch of Prisma glitter right on the background. So you can see it's sort of sticking to my ink blending a little bit. That's just because the ink is still a little bit damp. So once it dries completely, I'll just brush that excess away with a paintbrush. So while my background dries on the side, I'm going to work on some of the die cut elements for the card. I'm using the Stitch Rainbow to create my rainbow, and I'm also using the Little Music Notes die set to create this rainbow with the music, almost like Kermit is singing. So I've got the base of my rainbow just cut from some white cardstock, and then each of the bows of the rainbow I've cut from a different color. So I'm using Guava, Fake Tan, Sunflower, Peacock, and Sugarplum to create my rainbow. I just put some glue all over that base, and then I can easily line up all the bows of the rainbow. I'm also using the new Tiny Gift Box frog add-on die. You can see I've cut my frog from some Cilantro cardstock. I've also got those eyes, so there's a solid piece that you can layer behind the white eyes. And then those will just go over the eyes of the box. So you kind of have two options when you're making the box of what kind of frog you want. There's also this piece that you cut that you layer behind the smile. So that's what this black piece is. So that's going to go behind his face. And you can see you could have a frog with small eyes, but to make it look more like Kermit, you know, he's got those big white eyes on top of his head, I'm going to add the white eyes. So I've just layered the solid black circles behind the white ones that have the little arches cut out for the eyes. And I just think that is so cute and looks so much like Kermit. So here's the little music notes. I've cut a bunch of those from some black cardstock and I've just arranged them on my rainbow. I've also cut a red heart so my rainbow has somewhere to end. This would also be cute with a cloud, but I think that the heart works better for the theme of this card. It doesn't make much sense. It's going to be coming out of the grass around the pond, and so I just thought the heart would be a good way to terminate my rainbow. So I've placed my little music notes where I want them on my rainbow, and I'm just using a little bit of liquid glue to glue them down. So now to cut the part that has the swish and pop holes. I don't want it right at the bottom. I want it a little higher on this particular card. And I already made a mock-up ahead of time to figure out what kind of space I needed for my rainbow to swing out of the way behind my frog. So I drew a line here and that's going to show me where I need to cut these little holes. So when you're using the swish and pop, the minimum amount from the bottom is the length of that arm that you see on the right side, but you can always make it taller, which is what I'm doing here. So I've run that through my die cut machine. Everything's nice and dry now, so you can see I was dusting off that excess glitter that kind of stuck to my ink on the background. I've cut the arm that you pull from some Guava Cardstock, and I'm going to cut the swinging arm from some acetate. So I've got two small brads here, and I can start to assemble my swish and pop arm. So first what you want to do is put the brad through the end of the arm that you're going to pull, and then you're going to put it through the bottom hole on the arm that moves. That top hole is where you're going to put the other brad, and this is going to go through that acetate arm and then one of the holes on the card base. And you can see how that's going to swing there. And I'm actually going to do a little testing, and I actually move it over a hole because it wasn't quite where I needed it to be. I'm going to cut my grass that's going to cover up this mechanism from some rainforest cardstock. You can see this is much taller than it needs to be. So I'm cutting the top straight piece first, and then that way I can trim it to the height that I really need it to be. So starting out with something taller, and then once I figure out where it needs to be to cover up that mechanism, I can just flip it over and mark it and trim it down to the height that I actually need. So I'm just going to draw a pencil line right along the bottom of my square background cardstock, and I know where to trim my grass. So now to sort of test out the range of motion, I'm going to put two glue dots. I just marked it on there where I wanted them to be. And that's going to hold my rainbow onto the clear acetate arm. And for this one, I want it to kind of move more in a semicircular pattern versus kind of an arch across the card. So I'm doing a little testing to make sure that it moves and ends up where I want it to be. So I'm trying to line this up to where my rainbow goes behind the frog and rotates around that brad and hides behind the grass. So you can see this is me testing it. Works pretty well. So I'm going to continue on. So this is the pond that's going to be in front of the grass. This is peacock cardstock, and I just cut the top of it with a simple stitch hillside to get that rounded look of the edge of a pond. And then I'm just going to glue that directly to the grass that I created. So there's lots of layers on this front panel here. I've cut one of the birch tree dies from some brown cardstock, and this is my little log that Kermit's going to sit on, so I'm just going to go ahead and put him on there. And then I'll just trim it to the length that I need. So I'm just going to sit him there for now. And now I need to create his banjo. Because as cute as this card is, I just feel like it is not complete without Kermit's musical instrument. So I've got some circles cut from some storm cloud cardstock and a stitched one from eggshell for the body of the banjo. And then I've got a strip cut from some narwhal cardstock. That is the fretboard here. I'm just going to put that on there. And I'm tucking it behind that eggshell piece so you get that nice finished look. And it's a little longer than I need it to be. So I'm just checking how it looks with him holding it there. So I know where I need to trim it down, about the length it needs to be. And then I've got a piece of really thick craft foam here, and this is what I use to poke holes in things. And I'm just using a sewing needle to poke 3 little holes down in the body of that banjo. This is where my strings are going to go. So I'm just pushing that down to create some holes so that I can thread some thread through there. This is a really thin needle, so it's kind of hard to push through all those layers of cardstock, so the pliers actually helped a lot. So once I have those holes poked, you can see those tiny little holes there. That's going to be my guide for my thread. And I actually just use a doubled up piece of black sewing thread, so you get that nice thin string for your banjo. I've tied a knot in the back. So I'm going to start with one of these holes at the bottom, and then I'm just wrapping it towards the top. And I thought I could just wrap it around, and I decided no, I really needed some holes to thread it through up there as well. And I'm going to cover these up and get that nice finished look eventually. But this held them in place so you get that nice spacing between these openings. And I'm just going to thread it back through the top and then go back towards the bottom. And then for the third one, I'll just go right into that hole right beside it and then back up towards the top. So I'm just making sure they're nice and straight, and I can just adjust them, make sure they're nice and taut. You can see it was a little loose on the back, so I can just kind of pull it and adjust them a little bit. And then once I have it nice and taut the way it needs to be, I'm just looping it through the pieces on the back and knotting it off. So I did a knot at the top, and then I'm also going to thread it down towards the bottom and do a knot at the bottom. So this will hold that thread in place nicely. So I've just looped it through, looped it back through itself so it's knotted off, and then I can just trim off the extra thread. So now to add a couple details to finish it off, I have a tiny little piece of black cardstock. I'm going to use that to cover up the holes at the bottom. And then I've got another piece of storm cloud cardstock that's just cut to a little square here. And that is going to be the handle at the top. And I think this banjo turned out just super cute. And it's the perfect size for Kermit to hold. I did decide that I wanted that piece at the top a little bit darker, so instead of pulling it off and putting a piece of black cardstock, I'm just coloring it with my black marker to make it black. So I'm just going to trim off that extra piece of acetate sticking up past my rainbow now that my rainbow's in the right place and I don't need to move it around anymore. And then I'm going to glue this whole piece to a 5.5 inch by 5.5 inch card. So making sure it's lined up straight on that card base. And I made sure I didn't put any glue where those brads are so that they can move freely between the card base and this Bristol cardstock that's on top. So you can see it moves pretty freely. That Guava Cardstock pull tab is a little bit flimsy, and I am going to reinforce that here in just a bit. But first, I'm going to start by cutting the little notch that you need to grab hold of that tab. So I've got my pieces that go in the front, and I'm using the die that cuts the notch. You line it up with the edge of the cardstock, and then those little notches that stick out, you line up with the tab. I'm also going to mark where this is going to fall, and when I pull my rainbow, how far I need it to go. I kind of want that heart to be straight up and down. So you can see I'm marking where that rainbow is going to hide so that I know where to put my adhesive so that it's out of the way of these moving pieces. So I'm going to put all this foam tape down here. You can see how I'm moving it around, making sure it's staying out of the way of the moving pieces. But I want it to be very well supported because there's a lot of layers to this front panel that's going to cover this up. And I'm also going to double up the adhesive. So you can see I'm pulling those off and adding a second layer of that foam just to make sure that there's enough space back there for all of this to move around. So this is where I'm doubling up that arm. So I just cut another one from Guava Cardstock, and I'm just going to laminate the two together and give me a much stronger pull tab. And part of the reason I needed to do this for this card is because that rainbow is a pretty heavy die cut piece. You have to think that it's a bunch of layers of cardstock together, so you're pulling something that is not just a tiny little heart or a star flying through the air. You've got that whole rainbow and it's a little bit heavy, so reinforcing the tab is really a good idea. And now you can see that it doesn't bow up like it was doing before. I've pulled off all the liner pieces from my foam tape, and I'm just gonna layer my pond piece on top. And now I can check that that moves freely. I'm also gonna add Kermit and his log that I glued together earlier, making sure I'm not putting any glue towards the top of his head because that's gonna go past the grass and that's where the rainbow is, and we wanna make sure that I don't get any adhesive up there that might stick to that rainbow and keep it from moving. So I've got him placed perfectly so that the rainbow hides behind him. And now I can trim off the log as well as the tab that we're going to pull, because now I know where it's going to end up or where it needs to end up. I'm going to go ahead and add that little decorative piece that goes on the end of the tab that has the arrow and tells the recipient to pull the tab for something to happen. And then I'm going to add his banjo that I created earlier. I'm putting some thin foam squares on it so it has a little bit of dimension. And then I'm going to use the new slimline Grassy Hillsides. I know that I don't need that length, but the curve is a little bit different, a little bit more shallow, and it worked really well to give me some curved grass at the front that didn't go too high. I'm also going to cut the cattails from some noble fir cardstock, and I'm actually going to cut those apart. I just want the groupings of cattails. I don't need it to be a border because the border is my grass at the front. So I'm just going to trim off the pieces in between, and I actually wanted the one with 3 to be on the right side, so this works well to cut it apart like that. And this one I'm actually going to glue kind of sideways to get the cattails where I want, because the bottom's going to get covered up, so I'm just going to trim off that extra piece. And you can see now those cattails are going to look like they're coming out of my really thin grass cut from Rainforest cardstock at the bottom. Then I'm also going to add the brown part of those cattails. These is cut from some paper bag cardstock, so it's a little bit lighter than the log that he's sitting on, so you have a little bit of variation in those browns. And then here is my finished card. I just love how this card turned out. I really did sing Rainbow Connection in my head the whole time I was making this, but I just think it's so much fun and it turned out so perfect. And you can see in my final card, I actually did add some glitter to the cattails and the grass at the bottom to balance it out with the glitter of the vines at the top. And I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Thanks so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.